Okay, let's get started. We are still working on lecture number 1 for those brand new people here. Wait until I'm all done, and then I'll bring you up to speed with what you missed last week. Well, you didn't miss anything last week. It was a holiday. So what you missed the week before. So this is the second part of this particular lecture, and I'm still working on, I think I made it to, what, slide number 30 or something? I think I made it like halfway in the middle of this, although there's no slide numbers on here. We talked about HTML. Well, let me just give you a recap for those of you who weren't here. This is lecture number 1, and the goal of the lecture was to introduce HTML, XML, and XHTML in terms of the terminology, because we really have to know what it is we're working with before we start programming in it, seriously. And some web basics. So I talked last time about the concept of hyperlinking, about tags. So hopefully you remember the opening and the closing tags as a concept of markup for formatting. Talked about hyperlinking, linking documents to documents to documents. The concept of the World Wide Web was also covered in terms of document interexchange. So we know we have the internet, we have HTTP protocol, talked about last time, where we have web housing and the web, or the World Wide Web. When we go www dot something, we can go http:// dot or colon, www something. It's all pretty much the same protocol. Talked about the concept of the web browser, reading those protocols and working with HTML. Hyperlinks, let's see what else. We talked about the web page. The concept of the Uniform Resource Locator, or URL, taking us to a location through a web browser, giving us document control. I talked about, I didn't really talk about URI versus URL, but it's many different types of names of addresses, essentially. Talked about the concept of a website, what would be referred to as a website versus a web page. A web page is a single document. A website is a bunch of documents all put together to form kind of like an application, but it's not really an application, it's kind of a website in a unique kind of form. I don't know how else to describe that. Talked about the definition of hypertext markup language, which is what we're studying in this course, essentially. How to take tags in terms of a markup language. So hopefully you remember that HTML doesn't do any type of programming, per se. It is strictly a markup language, kind of like a document formatter that takes and formats things and puts them the way we want to see them. The concept of the markup language, the symbols, the sets, which is what we're studying. And I think I went this far as well, looking at standard generalized markup language, where it started from. I didn't really talk very much about the history, but that's essentially where it's come from the beginning, was SGML. It turned into HTML. We kind of got rid of the GL concept, and that moved over into XML, actually. So I'll talk a little bit more about that today to fill in the gaps for you in terms of that technology. And the target output format, essentially the web page, the online help systems, the online anything associated with that. We actually covered this part as well, the basic HTML syntax. The concept of the tag, and if you remember, we drove out opening and closing. The only thing difference was a / on the ending tag. And as we go through the tags in this course, starting with lecture number 2, probably not till next week, I would believe, we'll see how the tags kind of come in sets, as I showed you, with an opening and closing, and we can nest the tags inside of tags, and then we can pretty much manually create our interface, or our look and feel of the document. I had a couple of students actually send me email messages asking if they could use Microsoft Front Page. I think somebody else mentioned another, like Dreamweaver or something, and something else. The purpose of this course is to actually learn the HTML and actually learn the CSS concepts, and you're going to do everything manually. So just in case you're wondering, the answer to all those questions is no. Yeah, it would be a lot easier to bring up Front Page and use a drag and drop and put elements on a page. The only problem is you're not really learning how to use HTML. You're not really learning how to create style sheets either. And you're probably, well, why do I need to know this? That's a good question. Even if you're a Facebook user, MySpace user, maybe you like to write fancy HTML email messages and put things in bold and underline and stuff and do it manually, you can do the same language. The HTML language works with all of those applications. So you can utilize the skills of knowing what the tags are to create all sorts of different fancy interfaces or pages, format your text essentially for anything that's HTML compatible that accepts HTML text. So let's see, we looked at the, there's the brackets, as I mentioned before, the opening and closing brackets that consists of starting and ending tags as a concept. And we got this far, looked at, and this is just a quick glance at some of the common tags that exist. And part of what we're doing next week is actually starting in and formatting some text. So what I'll do is I'll bring up a notepad document next week and I'll show you opening and closing tags, and we'll see things transpire. We'll look at how we can bold something, how we can underline something, and kind of take it from there. We also covered the different parts of an HTML document last week. We started off with the concept of the HTML tag. And so all of the HTML documents beginning with HTML is a tag. So this tag would happen to show up at the beginning of the document. This one actually would show up at the end. We talked about as well the head and the body tag. So we have a header section, we have a body section to the document as well, which kind of gives us our ability to put different types of tags in each one of the different sections. And I also mentioned how HTML works with scripting languages like PHP and Python and Perl and a bunch of other kind of common scripting languages. If you take a web development course, they generally teach you the languages. So you end up looking at, how do I make how do I ask for input out of Perl, or and then you mix it in with HTML, and that's all hand coded. That's all written by hand as well. So knowing how to use Microsoft Front Page isn't going to help you with that. So this is why you're learning the HTML, so you can mix it in with scripting languages and stuff. And we can embed HTML inside of other types of documents. All we have to do is include this opening and that closing bracket to say that now we want to write some HTML code. And then we say this is the header, this is the body, and we start looking at formatting the document itself. So the head tag, if you remember, contains everything useful to the web browser. And remember, I talked a little bit about, actually I think I even looked at the history of web browsers and all the different things associated with it. The web browser is the interpreter. It's nothing on the computer. So different web browsers bring up different HTML texts, and they show it differently. And what might look good in Firefox might not actually work in Internet Explorer, vice versa, or Chrome, because the browser may not necessarily have support for whatever tag set or for whatever technology you're actually using. And the browser is actually where we get the JavaScript control as well. The browser plugins, I'm sure everybody's dealt with that, especially Flash as an example. You get a little message and you have to install it. Well, when are you installing it into the browser, actually? You're not really installing it on an application on the computer. And the head section is where you talk to the browser, where you say, hey, I'm going to use JavaScript, or hey, I'm going to use Flash. I'm going to use something, and it tells the browser information. And one of the classic things people put in the head section would be the title that would show up in the menu bar. So at the top of the window, you say, my website, it's scrolling and it's flashing and it's doing all the fancy stuff. Well, they just put some HTML tag in the header section of that document. So we have pairs of tags that contain references to the document head. We also have underneath that what's called the body, or the main contents of the particular web page that we're dealing with. There is no tail. There's just a head and a body. So we don't have the end is the end, isn't it? I don't know. So if we're mixing in HTML code with a scripting language, we might not actually put in a head and a body. And you're probably wondering, well, what does it matter? Actually, it doesn't matter. We can leave all these sections out, and we can just have one body, let's say. However, now we're not really using a standard. We're hacking it. We're playing around with HTML. Because, think about it, you're on MySpace and you're going to make something funny on you're going to put an animated GIF on your homepage or something. Well, you just put the tags in there. You're not actually saying HTML, end HTML, header, body. You're not doing any of that. And that's why I kind of waited to explain that actually until today, because this is really part of XHTML, which basically creates a standard that mixes in a proper way of doing something, so you have the ability to actually inter-exchange documents with other computers, with other programs, that are going to read the document, that are going to be able to, translate it somehow and use it somehow. It's sort of like an application, sort of. But there's a driving force right now, actually, to make everything XHTML, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And get rid of HTML as a concept, only because it's more compatible. Web browsers right now still only work with HTML. Some of the newer versions and the Chrome browser actually works with XML and XHTML. But in order to get all browsers to be compatible that way, well, we have to get people to write code. We have to get people to write XHTML and not HTML. If you go to the W3Cs I mentioned last time, in fact there was a slide that I think, or I don't know if I showed you the website, but you can actually go to the website, upload your HTML document, and it can tell you if it's compatible or not. It can tell you everything that's wrong with it. And the reason why you want to know that it's correct, or you want to create correct stuff, is so that it's compatible across different platforms. So if we have a translator that's making your website that you created on your internet, not your website, your space I should say, compatible with somebody's iPhone or Android phone, and that Android browser, it's looking for a standard kind of format with a header, it's with a body section, and it's looking for opening and closing. There's certain rules that you have to follow in terms of the HTML syntax to be compatible, so it's actually read correctly, and it can be translated correctly, so it looks good. And until we've actually been able to bring up, web pages, websites on different platforms outside of a computer, there really hasn't been a strong need for that. But now, as we're using more mobile devices than we are computers these days, now it's like a must. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about today, is XML as a standard and XHTML and what the differences are. But to finish my little review from last time, what we're talking about in terms of the web browser support is it's a parser. It reads in the text file and translates it and puts the output onto the screen for you. It's almost like a compiler / interpreter. It's really referred to as parsing. So you'll see that a lot in terms of parser support in web browsers. And depending upon what tags you're using, then we've got the ability to essentially be compatible, hopefully, and actually do some unique stuff. Also looking at various attributes that are associated with the tag. If we consider font as an example, to say, font, well, some attributes according to a font would be its size, its color, its size, how big it is, and those are basically sets of attributes. So when you learn how to write in HTML formatting, you don't memorize 2,000 or 3,000 tags. You learn pretty much the tag sets, like font as an example, and then you figure out, well, let's see, font size, font color, and you learn all the built-in names of all the different font colors. There's only about 8 of them, and then you figure out, which ones do I use most often. And then you memorize kind of like the functional stuff, and then the rest of it you look up, which is why you always see a lot of lookup sites on the internet. If actually all you have to do is type in HTML, and you'll see thousands of websites that come up. In fact, most of them, like 90% of them right now, have a little window. You can actually type the HTML tag and you press go, and it shows you what it looks like. So you can actually test it out. Because one of the things you don't get when you're writing this in Notepad is the ability to actually see what you're writing. And I think I mentioned before, we don't actually have to put it on the internet. We could leave it on our desktop, double-click on it, open it up in the browser, and have the browser interpret it for us. There's some IDEs out there, integrated development environments, that allow you to write HTML that way. If that's what you want to use, you may. However, you can't use one of those what you see is what you get type of drag and drop HTML editors, because then you're not really learning the text, you're not really using them. So, all right, looked at a little bit about how we use the attributes, starting with the closing bracket, before the closing bracket, in the starting tag. We looked at hello world. And hello world, let's see if I think I finally figured out how to make this bigger. Nope. I thought it was command, maybe it was option shift. Nope. Alright, well, I think it's gonna be small for you. I had the key down, but it's not working. I'll make it bigger. But you know what, the resolution is set pretty high on here. Maybe it won't go any bigger. Who knows? This is what we're going to be doing next week, actually. We'll be taking a look at the code and actually writing it out. So if you bring your computer next week, you can actually bring up a notepad document and kind of type along with me, and we can kind of see how the tags work. Because it's really boring if I come up here and say, this is the bold tag, opening B, ending B. Yeah, it's really nice to see what it looks like, actually, and to see how you nest it together. Because what ends up happening is we'll end up making a mistake. You know, the tags won't match, or you'll leave out a closing tag or something, and then you'll look at it and go, wow, the whole entire document's bold. How'd that happen? You know, and then you can kind of see what it looks like, and troubleshooting. In fact, that's the hardest part, I would say, about learning how to write XHTML or HTML code in general, is troubleshooting, because it's not like a compiler is going to tell you missing end tag. Instead, it's just going to be all bold. Better yet, actually, sometimes it won't show up at all. The whole page will be blank, and you'll be like, well, what happened? I have all this text, nothing's showing up. It's because I have it all in the header, or I don't have it in the body, because it's not going to actually show up on the screen if you put it in the header. It might, hopefully it'll show up if you put it in the body. So, all right, so we looked at Hello World. We looked at the parts that I showed you last week were, the header, for the head section here. We have the head, and we have the opening and closing tag for that. And we have the HTML opening and closing tag, and we have the body opening and closing. And then inside, in the middle here, we have a bunch of tags. We have H1 for a header, H2 for a second level header. That's the stuff we're going to start with next week. And, what are these tags? And eventually what we're going to move to is, let's not even use the tags. Instead, let's just apply a style sheet. But until you can actually, and this is the CSS portion of the course, but until you can actually apply the HTML code and know what the tags are, you can't really create a style sheet, because the style sheet is using the HTML tags. so you start out doing this, and you can probably find there's probably going to be some issues. And for example, this is one page. It's a Hello World website. What if we have like 12 pages on this website? The reason why CSS is so popular these days is we write one style sheet, we apply it to all 12 pages. And then voila, all the same look and feel, same color combo, same font size, everything is consistent among all of the different web pages in our website. Here we've manually put in a header, a paragraph. Oh, let's put this in italics, let's put this in bold. And we've used paragraph tags. So what we do with CSS is we say, for a paragraph, it's going to be indented 5 spaces. And it's going to have all of the text in bold, or italics, let's say, or it's going to have this color using that font size and this font's type and stuff like that. So every time we use a tag like this P for paragraph, it applies all of our built-in formatting for us. So essentially what we're doing with CSS is we are creating what's called a cascading style sheet. That's what CSS stands for. And it goes in order of precedence. So we include the style sheet in our document, and we put it in the header section. It doesn't work anywhere else. Or we define the style inside of the document. We'll be looking at both of those two techniques. And then we use the style sheet inside of the document. And then we can also override the style inside of the document. So this stuff can still work. And it's cascading, which means it goes in the hierarchy. So it starts out with a style sheet, and then, do we have anything locally defined? Oh yes, that overrides the style sheet. And then here we have a tag on this word, and it's highlighted or something. It's in purple or something. That's gonna override whatever cascaded before it, essentially. And that is basically how modern day people actually create these HTML documents. Because what it gives you is a consistent look and feel, but it also gives you the flexibility of overriding something. And for this particular page, we want this line, this paragraph, to be in red, and we don't want the whole so we don't want to apply it to every document. It's just this one paragraph. And then we have the freedom to override it, which is the basic power of CSS. So we looked at the differences between web page design and authoring, looking at the concept of looking at images, visual effects, design effects. If you took a, and this is kind of like what I described in the day number 1, actually, where this is what this course is about. It's not a website design course. If this were a website design course, I'd be showing you best practices for how to actually get the proper look and feel, the user interface, the design of the website, how to create a site map, how to create a menuing system, all of those other fancy little things that are associated with websites. And no, this is just HTML and CSS. So you're not going to learn any of that stuff in this class. Although I'll show you how to put images in, and I'll show you, but I'm not going to go over anything associated with the look and feel of the website. You can actually create really ugly websites in this course and get an A. You're not being graded on design. You're also not being graded on authoring. Authoring refers to the creation and assembly of the tags, the attributes, the data that make up the website. Your tag creation concepts are more CSS related in terms of what do we need to do. What do we need to know HTML-wise to create good CSS pages? So I'll talk about a little bit more in terms of the CSS authoring technique, how to set the standard, how to make things compliant across different web pages, which actually works more with the XML than anything else. So, subtle difference but important distinction. In terms of website design, teaches you the visual graphical. The book XHTML, which is what this lecture notes are actually based upon, teaches you basic concepts needed to get started with tags and HTML code. Oh yeah, we did get this. Did we get this far? I think we got this far. We looked at the W3Cs, I think, last time. Well, that was a couple weeks ago. I can't remember either. That's why I'm refreshing my memory. What did I talk about? Let's see. Where you can upload. It's a web browser website. You could upload your page there. You could actually see if it is compliant. Yeah, we did. We talked a little about the consortium. We talked about a little bit about the start, 1994, which is not too long ago in terms of the project. Nothing is really standardized yet. HTML is not a standard language. XHTML is. And we went through memory lane on web browsers, I think. And then I noticed that Netscape's now Mozilla. Well, it's part of Mozilla. It's not even around anymore, I don't think. It's part of Firefox. But we took a little trip down memory lane. I think we ended here. That's where I think we ended. So we're back up to where I started, or ended. So XML versus HTML. And I have to talk about XML as well, which is a totally different concept. So now we have what's called user agents. So prior to XHTML, we had web browsers and web browser support, which is great if you're, creating a website that's going to be used on a computer. Now we have what's called user agents. And I forgot my timepiece. There we go. Okay, now I'm in sync with my time. So, a user agent, which our device is capable of retrieving and processing XML. And the classic example of this I gave you last time was the cell phone, the mobile phone. We also have devices that don't have user interfaces to them that are internet or web enabled. And they read XML and they read XHTML code for document exchange. As an example, you ordered something from iTunes and you filled out a form. A document gets sent. A piece of information, usually in the form of data, aka a file. A document comes from your mobile device, your cell phone, something, and it gets sent to a computer over at Apple. And that computer logs the sale of the music file and starts the download. There's no humans involved. So if there were humans involved, they would have higher staffing needs than the IT probably. They would have a ton of people working there for every time someone sold something. So it's all done essentially electronically, computer to computer. It uses a combination of XML and XHTML. And the reason why it's XHTML and not XHTML is that the X in XHTML gives it XML compatibility. Makes it XML, and I'll talk about XML in a few minutes. Actually, I'll just briefly mention right now. The big difference between all of these technologies is HTML and XHTML is used for document formatting, as we've seen. XML is used for data. It formats and transmits data in almost the same way. It uses tags. So we have a tag that says first name, and then we have the name, and we have ending first name. Another tag that says social security number, or I don't know, credit card number. All the things you would need to send Apple to say, hey, I want to buy this song. So it tags it, but it doesn't read it, doesn't show it in the browser. There's an engine on the other end, an XML interpreter or parser, that takes that code, translates it into a sales receipt or purchase request, and transmits the order for you, sends back a confirmation or something, or tells you, or starts the download for you. Bank wire transfers, XML code, done that same way. Computer to computer talking, transmitting data. And with the EDI, electronic data exchange, is XML based. All these technologies were rooted back to what used to be SGML that turned into XML and also HTML. But it's like one of the oldest technologies that's actually still being used outside of TCP/IP, but you know, that's a different story. So what we're looking at in terms of XHTML is going beyond the browser for document exchange. So PDAs, phones, anything that has a processor on it that can actually read in and do something without your control. So a lot of the email you get when it's using a POP, but it's using XML to go retrieve. It says, give me the user information for this, and you get a little notification at the top of your phone. Say, hey, you got 3 new emails. That's XML based. So, but it's working through an email client instead of a web browser. So let's look at the evolution here. HTML has evolved into the markup language connected with data that appears, then the data itself. So the data itself is the XML component. The XHTML is the mock-up of it. Current older web browsers allow you to write sloppy HTML code because you don't necessarily have to be XHTML compatible. About half the people out there have websites that don't look good on mobile phones. Or they have multiple versions of websites. One of them is what you can do in the header is say, what kind of client is attached to me? Who's retrieving this document? If it's a mobile phone, you get a different image, like how Yahoo, Google actually do it. You get a different presentation that shows up, which is one of the choices. Otherwise, that page isn't going to look that good. So the language itself had to transform from HTML to XHTML. It's more than just the support for XML. It became a more standardized language that was more feature-rich. And we ended up with new tags and new naming conventions and new procedures to use with that. So it's based on SGML, as I mentioned before. It uses a document type definition, a DTD, that defines the tags and the attributes that you can use in a document. As an example, I'm not going to scroll back to it, but remember that little slide I showed you? There's some common HTML tags. Those are common HTML tags, a bold, underline, stuff like that. XHTML allows you to create your own tags. Problem with creating your own tags, however, is that not every web browser out there is going to support your tags. So you have one that says, opening bracket barb, closing bracket barb. What's barb? So we have a different document called a DTD, and we have a different document exchange protocol that we can use to say, here are the tags I'm using in my documents, and apply them, which is the wave of future web browsers. Not quite the standard yet, but some of the newer ones are experimenting with, load in a document definition, load in a document type definition, load in all this information, load in the custom tags, apply the tags to the document. Now you're probably wondering, well, why do we want to do this anyway? Well, it's just like any programming language. If you think of the concept, we have basic data types, and then the programmer is allowed to have user-defined types, because some of the stuff doesn't exist in the language. That's one of the problems with HTML. You're only allowed to use what's there, and there might not necessarily be a tag that you want to use, especially if you're mixing this with XML. The tag might not exist. So you could actually create your own tags. In XML, you have to create your own tags. There are no default tags. So you're working with a language that you not only have to define before you use it, but then you have to actually make sure that the support exists in the application or in the interface that you're using it with. And XML is not generally something that you actually see in a web browser, although some of the current web browsers are starting to support it. So you could write an XML document, and I think I have an example coming up, and bring it up in a web browser and actually have the web browser do something with it. What is it going to do? It's just going to identify the components, essentially. Say, hey, this is the first name, this is the last name, this is the credit card number. So a lot of credit card processing actually uses XML as well. Alright, so in terms of the evolution, the document conforms. It's associated to a DTD, as I mentioned before. That stands for document type definition, probably a new word. And it defines the tags and the attributes that can be used in the document. So it's a brand new set of tags that you've created. And the rules that the document must follow. There's a standard DTD that complies with XHTML that was created by the W3Cs, the consortium that says, and this consortium is only out there because it wants to standardize everything. There's standard DTDs now that you can use and apply to be compliant, so you don't have to create your own, which is excellent. And the standard ones, they contain everything HTML actually contains, plus a few extra things in there. So when the document conforms, we are associated with a DTD that is compliant with the W3Cs. We say it's valid. So when we upload our documents to check with the W3Cs to see, is this a valid? It'll come back valid, invalid. It also has a couple of other different ratios or scales associated with it that basically says, you know, does it conform or does it not conform? You might be wondering, well, why do we care if it conforms? It's going to show up anyway. In fact, all these, whether they conform or don't conform, probably all going to look the same on the screen. Problem is, what about those future applications that might try to use your document? They might try to read it on a microwave oven or something, you know, or I don't know, in a car, on some device that never really thought about, you know, I didn't think we were actually going to show my document on this particular device, but it's on the internet. The internet's public, the internet is open to anything and everything that connects to it. So if it complies to this, then you're building a browser that's compatible with this, and the browser works on the microwave oven, then your document should work on the microwave oven, essentially. I don't know why you're doing, you know, I could see if you were bored standing in front of the microwave, you could show pictures of somebody's vacation or something, I don't know, from some website. I guess you could have an application of the future that does something like that. So you can check whether the document conforms and whether it's associated by using a validation parser, and this is the validating parsers I've been talking about with the W3Cs. So you upload there's a website. We'll look at it. I can't remember if I looked at it already in this class, but if not, we're going to see it again next week. You'll see how a couple of documents look great, but they don't conform. They're invalid completely. So in terms of the basic style, it requires the DTD and in HTML DTD built into the web browser for web browser support. So if you write XHTML code and you're using an Netscape 3.0 browser or something of the past, you're going to get errors all over the place. It's not going to work. And this is why, you know, sometimes you use Chrome. Chrome is actually pretty up to date because Chrome is all XHTML compatible, and they're actually XML. You can run XML code in Chrome as well. And that's going to look better. So that's why everyone's, you know, it's like so important to upgrade your browser, essentially, even as a computer user, because all the new stuff that's coming out, you're not going to see images, you're not going to see animations, you're going to see anything on an old browser. So it opens up the document, it first compares the document to the DTD, it comes up with a dictionary of all the different tags, it applies the tags, and then you see what you see is what you get, essentially, from that point forward. In terms of the HTML, if it's missing any other required tags that it supplies it, nothing's going to be rendered, or the browser's not going to render correctly. So it might not show up on the screen. As I was saying before, you could write some perfectly good HTML code and nothing shows up on the screen. And this happens a lot of times when you go to websites in non-supported browsers and it's blank. And you go, how come it's not loading? And you try another browser, oh, this one loads. Firefox, believe it or not, is more up-to-date than Internet Explorer. And we'll see later in the course, they actually have different DTDs built into them. So that's why documents don't always look the same in the same browser. So what a website people do, well, they make sure it works in all different browsers. And in the header, you can actually say, are you opening me with an Internet Explorer browser? Is this Firefox? Is this Chrome? Figure out what browser you got, and then you can actually apply the tags correctly. So it's kind of like right in the beginning in the head section of the HTML document, you figure out what you're working with. Very common to do that these days. The XHTML compatibility will take that away, so we won't have to. It'll work anyway, which is kind of the goal. In terms of extensible markup languages, or XML, so XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. It marks up data, it doesn't mark up text. So HTML is hypertext markup language. This is extensible, well, I can't say that word, but think of it, you can extend the language. You can create your own language out of this. In fact, you have to. Defines the transmitting of the data between applications. So like HTML, XML is based on SGML, as I mentioned before. We're still on 1.0. We haven't progressed past that. In fact, at the current time of this writing, which was about a year ago, I just recently looked, we're still on 1.0. We haven't gotten very far with this. Because you know what? It requires millions and millions and millions of people to change what they've been doing for years. And to buy into this as a concept. So, it's hard to get them to change programming languages. How are you going to get them to conform with HTML? Plus, if it's not broken, you're not going to fix it. And there's millions of websites out there that have been created years ago that are never going to change. Well, until somebody new comes in and creates a better website for it, or something of that nature. So let's look at the basics of XML, because we looked at HTML last week. So we're referring to the tag pairs and the data that contains as an element. Same thing, very similar, but this is an element that we're putting between tags. All elements must have an opening and closing bracket. Kind of sounds familiar. Same format as HTML. And it contains the element opening and closing bracket. What we have refers to as the content, which is in between the element, or the content that is encompassed by the whole thing. So the declaration should be an XML declaration. So we say in the beginning, opening tag HTML. Now we can have an opening tag that says XML. And we can put XML inside of HTML. And I know on the course title it said, I don't know if it said HTML or XHTML and CSS for the name of this course. We can't do HTML. We have to do X. Does it say X or does it say HTML? HTML. They should really change it so it says XHTML and CSS. Because it would be, you can't use CSS with HTML. I mean, you can, but it's sloppy. And the future is XML plus HTML or XHTML. So you add them together and you get XHTML. Because we can't talk about HTML really without talking about this in terms of what it's doing these days. So we have different versions of XML that are being used. We specify them at the header. Different than HTML. In HTML, we just say HTML at the top of the page. We don't say HTML version 1.0. Why? Because we actually have to load on a document template definition language. And we have to have support for the XML of this different version in the browser. Same way as we have support for the HTML. But everybody gives HTML support by default. Not everybody does XML. So until everybody does, we still have to put the version number up there. Not required to include the XML declaration because currently only the one version that we have is 1.0, so you don't actually have to put the 1.0 in there. But I assume, hopefully, maybe in the next year or so, we might have 2.0. But 1.0 has been out for about 4 or 5 years so far. Hasn't progressed any further, which is interesting. If you take an Android development course, however, or if you take mobile development courses, it's all XML. Even in the interpretation of the language, everything's XML based because that's the new definition language that's pretty much being used. So it's good practice to always include the declaration. However, you can actually leave it out if you wanted to as well. In terms of parsing it, we have different things. So we had invalid and valid that were associated with XHTML. And we uploaded it to the W3Cs and we said, is this valid or invalid? Yeah. Now we have different levels of conformity. And if it adheres to all of the XML syntax rules, it's said to be well-formed. We also have, different scales, and we'll see that. But well-formed is what you want. And I say, well, what do you? Well-formed is different from valid or invalid. Because well-formed says I think it's like over 70% of the tags are read correctly. Compatible? Which means your document's well-formed. I don't know. Versus valid or invalid. So, I guess with valid or invalid is this HTML document going to work on an XML parser would be valid or invalid. In terms of the XML code, are we well-formed? Are we partially formed? Do we have tags that aren't defined? Have we got the opening and closing brackets correctly? We have a lot more mistakes that can actually happen with XML. So, we choose a program called a parser to check whether the XML document is well-formed. Interesting, a lot of games are nothing more than XML parsers these days. That's why I mentioned iPhone and Android development. You write XML code that goes into a parser. You create a parser is what you're doing. You're parsing the XML code that's got user parameters, settings, and then you're spitting out XML code for the interaction. and the programming style is really an XML-based kind of application that's looking at parsing the data and processing the data. So the two types of parsers are non-validating and validating. Non-validating parsers aren't used in websites. They're used in games. They're used in custom-made parsers that are out there. Validating are ones that say, this EDI, your EFT, your electronic funds transfer is going to work or it's not going to work. It doesn't partially work. Either you're going to get your paycheck or you're not. Given the information that the XML spit over to the bank from your application that you filled out that gave you all the routing numbers and the bank stuff. So it's going to be validating or non-validating. If it's validating, it's a yes or a no. If it's non-validating, it's a game that runs a little funny, but it still works. So less critical stuff, you can actually have non-validating. Websites are non-validating because we may not necessarily have a web browser that supports it. So why restrict the user from actually seeing the content? You know, why we just avoid it? We just turn it off, essentially. We don't use it. So parsing the document itself, non-validating parsers simply check whether the XML document is well-formed. And then the validating parser checks whether the XML is well-formed and also conforms to the associated DTD, the document type, the definitions in terms of defining those tags. So if we have tags in there that don't exist, then it won't pass the validation. So just think of it as different levels of criticality or in terms of the purpose of using it. So writing a well-formed document, let's talk about well-formed documents because the same standard exists with XHTML. So it allows user agents to read the document data easily. So we expect the data to be in a structured order. So we have specific rules that need to be followed and that allow the agent to read the data quickly, decipher the data, interpret the data, and not make mistakes. It's kind of like we can't afford to make mistakes in some of these applications that we're using this for. Hello. Oh, there we go. So what I'm going to go through is kind of differences, and when you go through this, think of this more as differences between XHTML and HTML. HTML is nothing more than tags. Using tags, not following any standards or any rules. It's just having the ability to mock up the text. Now, if we want to be XML, to contain well-formed documents that are validated, we have to follow these rules. If we follow the rules, then we're writing XHTML code. I don't know why they're still using HTML. They should just cross the word out. Because now if you learn HTML, you're going to learn XHTML by default. I mean, why be sloppy about it? And learn it right. So we have to have the root element. So the root element contains all of the other elements in the document. So we actually have to have HTML up there. If we don't have it, it's going to be not validated. It's not going to work correctly. So the element here with the opening and closing element is the root element. Almost most don't require the document. They don't require the document to include it. Most web browsers don't. But XML parsers, XHTML parsers require it. So these are all things that are these are the things that make HTML sloppy. Leaving out the, in fact, all you got to do is go to a couple websites, view the source from the web browser, and you'll see how sloppy some of these professional websites are. Usually it's in the file or the view menu. It says view source. You're looking at the source of the HTML page, and you'll see, no opening and closing HTML, a bunch of stuff. So you have to have the root element, or it's required the root element that you define yourself. So here we have case sensitivity. So last week, I think someone even asked, is it case sensitive or something like that? Well, unlike HTML tags, we have case sensitivity in XML. A lowercase b is different from an uppercase b. So we have case sensitivity as well in XHTML if we follow the standard correctly. But you can mix it. So, well, you can't mix it. So with XML, you cannot mix the case of the elements. So sloppy HTML would put a capital B for bold, and then they'd have the words, and then they have the closing tag, and it would be in a lowercase b. And if this was an XML HTML parser, it would come back and say non-validated. Piece of garbage, throw me away. I'm not going to take you. Because you mixed the case. But it works. It's valid HTML code that can be used in a web browser all the time. So if you use different cases for an opening and closing tag, then you're treated as completely different separate statements, or separate tags actually, resulting in the document that's not well formed, that gets rejected. Most people when using XML will put the tags in capital letters. You probably could see why. It's easy to see the tags. If you get the tags in there and they're all in caps, you know, it's always going to be easy to remember, first of all, but it's also easier to see the tags. And most people who write XML tags put them in caps. So you don't have to. It's not required, as long as you don't mix them. You must have closing tags. This is interesting. Remember, I think I gave an example. If not, I'll give it again for those of you who last week are going to be bored again. But the horizontal rule, the HR, if you put an HR horizontal rule in Internet Explorer, you'll see a line that goes across the screen. If you bring up if you put an opening and a closing tag in there, HR for horizontal rule, and then nothing, and then a closing HR. In Internet Explorer, you'll see two lines. They go across the screen. In Firefox, you see one line. Because Firefox is XHTML compatible, which requires an opening and a closing bracket for everything. There are some exceptions, however. And Internet Explorer is HTML compatible. But it's not going to matter. You don't actually have to put the line in there. So sometimes something as simple as a horizontal rule, you'll find, you know, the browser is going to show it differently, which is why people like Chrome. It does actually a combination of both right now. So it's designed to organize data and not display it. So XML tags, all XML tags have to have an opening and a closing tag. HTML tags, with a few exceptions, have to follow the same rule if you're going XHTML route. So as a result, instead of a document containing text that contains elements, in this case HTML, what we have is XML documents consisting of elements that contain text. So we have opening and closing brackets. All elements must have a closing tag, or it's not going to be well formed. Doesn't mean the document's not going to work. It just means it's not going to be well formed. And here we go. Nobody ever does this. Nobody ever does this in HTML. How many people actually put a closing paragraph tag? I don't even do it. I'm sloppy. I won't even put it in there. I write HTML code 9 times out of 10 because I'm not going to pay attention to this stuff. So here we have nesting. We have XML elements that must be properly nested. So most of us kind of go, well, it's bold. Let's unbold it. Paragraph. Let's not even put a closing paragraph in here. Why do we have to? Seriously. It's not going to give us 2 paragraphs. If we're using Internet Explorer, it's going to put 2 okay, for those people who don't know what a paragraph is, it skips a line, so it's like a line return plus a line. So it puts a line in between each one of the paragraphs instead of a line break. Line break is just going to go to the next line. So paragraph actually creates a new line in between. In Internet Explorer, you'll have 2 lines, so there'll be double-spaced paragraphs. In Firefox, it'll be a single-spaced paragraph. If you're nesting opening and closing paragraph tags. So it refers to how the elements are placed. So here we have a paragraph, open up the paragraph, close the paragraph, bold it, unbold it, italicize it, unitalicize it. And it's supposed to be in reverse order. So we end it with an I, we start with an I, and we're going to close it. If we skip the order, get the order wrong, we're not validated. We're not well formed, we get rejected. So you can see how frustrating this is for some people, and they just give up on it. I mean, they go, oh, it works. If we switch the order here of this I and the B, actually, we could switch the whole thing around if we wanted to. It's still going to work. In an HTML-compatible browser, it'll work just fine, which most of our browsers are HTML-compatible, so it's going to work just fine. However, it's not going to conform. We're not going to be validated. It's going to be invalid. This paragraph is bold and italics. In fact, this gives you the orientation of what I'm going to show you next week. We're going to work through about 100 or so tags, see the text in bold, see it italicized, and stuff like that. So the document makes no reference on how the elements are nested. XML requires that the tags be closed the opposite direction. So HTML, because it makes no reference to it, we can do it. If we want to write XHTML code, then we have to follow XML rules. So if you're wondering, well, what rule do I need to follow? Only if you're going to use XHTML. And in the beginning of the times, this is why we have 2. we still have HTML and we still have XHTML, because not everybody, long time ago when this came out, when XML became popular, about, I don't know, long time ago, they envisioned that not everybody was going to use it, and so why bother? So now we have two different languages, XHTML, and also HTML. This is like a tongue twister for me. So, by the end of the day, I'll be like, la 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 la. So, that's why we have two languages, because if you're going to use XML in there, you got to be XHTML compatible, because you got to follow XML rules, because you're being read by an XML parser. You're not being read by an HTML parser. But nowadays, everybody's doing XML. Like the spike went up. Now everybody's got to be compatible. So, I mean, it's amazing how many applications on the web that are actually like utilizing it. When you're wondering why, well, because they're transferring data. They're keeping track of something. It could be used for database support, for shopping cart applications, for all sorts of different things. So. Attribute values must appear with quotation marks. So for some of you who actually write HTML code, now you're going to be wondering, now you're going to see the differences, and I'm going to teach you XHTML, so we'll be using quotation marks. But theoretically, we don't have to put attribute values in quotation marks in XML. What's an attribute value? Well, if I said font color equals blue, in XML that would be just fine. In XHTML, I'd have to say font color equals quotation marks blue. The attribute values of color, which equals red, the red has to be in quotation marks. Because it's a string, it's parsed differently. So in XML parsers, we identify strings, we identify text passages in terms of content for the screen, we identify data. And because of that, we have to separate all those three out, and we have to use it in our tag sets. If we just said red, it's going to bring it in as either a piece of data or as something not a string in terms of the attribute value. So let's see. In the HTML, attribute values can be placed inside quotation marks, or they can be left off. Sloppy. Or XML, you must place them in quotation marks around the values assigned to the attribute. So. Several different components. So empty elements must be closed. So I mentioned already the horizontal rule is actually referred to as an empty element, because we're not including any content with that. We're just saying put a horizontal rule across this. Well, we have BR for line break, HR, which is the one I gave you before, for horizontal rule. So in HTML, do not have actually corresponding any tags including HR, BR elements. And the BR is going to insert a new line in terms of a line break. Don't worry about memorizing all these tags at this point. Elements that don't require ending tags are called empty elements, because you cannot use them as a tag pair to enclose text or other elements, but you have to close them anyway. Because, again, and we're going back to that parsing thing, if it says it's an opening tag, if it's reading it as HTML, it has to have an opening, it has to have a closing, it has to be in the right order. If it doesn't have the closing, it can't parse the next line correctly. It doesn't know, it gets lost, essentially. Because think of it as a combination, we're reading XML and we're reading HTML at the same time. We have to decipher between the two. So some of these rules are just to make the parsing more reliable, make it more valid. So you can create an empty element in XML document by adding a single slash here. Same thing we have in HTML. So this backslash here, forward slash before the tag's closing bracket. To close the element, we can actually just put in here, back here. Remember I've been saying horizontal rule, and then we have the forward slash with a HR as a closing bracket in terms of the set. We don't even have to put that in. If it's just an empty element, we could just put the line in there. Put the line in between two of these little bracket things. So in here, erase HR and just put the line in there. That's valid in XML. Not valid in HTML, but valid in XML. Because it doesn't make sense to keep closing things like line breaks, horizontal rules, and stuff like that. It just doesn't make any sense. So that's a new tag. It's part of XHTML. That's not part of. They also have document tags, and we have all sorts of different things to look at as well. So let's see, where did I go here? There we go. So you put it in before, most often use an empty tag element. It does not require content, such as an image. Actually is an empty tag element as well. So combining it, although XML was designed primarily to define data, doesn't mean that you can't use it to create web pages. You can create web pages with XML. In fact, there's XML browsers. Excuse me, I shouldn't use that word browser. There's XML applications that read XML code and do things for you. That's a lot of the, when I went back to, I mentioned iPhone and Android applications, a lot of them you're creating XML parsers. And you're putting out stuff, and some of it's internet-based. And the application's going out, it's getting information, and it's parsing it. And the application is nothing more than a glorified XML parser. So, which is a lot of the Android interface. The screen is XML. So, if you took the Android, you know it's that because we were writing XML pages in that class. So, see, combining it now, so you can create formatted web pages using XML. Extensible style sheets. We're not going to look at this in the class, but I mentioned last week I defined CSS for you. HTML has cascading style sheets. XHTML can use cascading style sheets. And I defined what that was for you, hopefully you remember. Being able to create tags and attributes associated with the tags and use it kind of like a standard. We have a different language. We have XSL that is used for XML. And it's the same concept, it's a style sheet. But it creates data styles, data tags. So we know what a first name is, we know what a last name is, social security number, date of birth. We all know it defines that. Can also define the style. We can actually incorporate XML and HTML in terms of using XSL. Not very popular. It's confusing to most developers, and that's what you see is what you get things kind of do for you when you're doing application development and you're using one of those tools. Sometimes it will actually create these files for you, depending upon what you're trying to do. If you're writing XML code in those, it'll use this XSL for you. So it's specification for formatting, and we'll see that. It's formatting the XML code. So the XML code looks like HTML code in the web browser. Because sometimes you might want to put in an XML statement that says, what is your first name? And then have an input box. Well, that input box, you can actually create an XML. Take the input that comes from that and send it through an XML interface to a document exchange to update the database or something. Why do you want to go HTML to XML to the database? So it's easier just to do it all in one shot in the XML. So you make a transition from XML-based web pages, makes it easier. Hopefully with the W3Cs, combining it to create XHTML, and we finally got to the point of what XHTML is. It is nothing more than XML plus HTML. It's the same thing as HTML, but we've added on all the conformity to abide by all of the rules so that the HTML code can be used correctly with XML. Which gives us, there's a lot of rules, actually. And we're going to go over all the rules. So you've seen most of them. You've seen the major categories of rules. There's some tags that don't belong, actually. There's some new tags in XHTML. There's new versions of XHTML. If you weren't here for the last time, we have different versions of XML that has gone through the years, 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. We only have one XML, but we have a lot of different versions of XHTML, which is conformed to different needs. We have different tags now for different things. So when we combine them together, it's used to author websites, most identical HTML except for the XML syntax, describes parts of the documents. So that was the beginning. That was lecture number 1. I'm trying to look at my clock here. We're still good. We're still good. I can start in and then I'll end about halfway through the next one. No. This one actually I'm going to finish the whole thing, believe it or not. This is a repeat, so I can actually get through 13 slides in a half an hour or so. This is lecture 2 if you're downloading it. What I want to kind of do is put the pieces together of some of the technologies I missed, did not talk about in lecture number 1. Most of them being the difference between static and dynamic web pages, the difference between client-side and server-side web pages. For those of you with a computer science background, you're going to be extremely bored. For those of you who are coming from a business area, you're going to love this stuff because it's going to put the pieces together, hopefully in terms of some of the terminology. So understanding the terminology, I'm not going to get through the protocols. You can study that on your own in terms of the addresses, in terms of the URLs, because this isn't really a networking course, but I figured I might as well, because later on I'll be talking about client-side, server-side, all these different technologies, and you're going to be sitting here going, what? So we all know HTML is client-side, right? Yeah. So you're going to be like, what? What do you mean by client-side? So that's what the purpose of this lecture is all about. Reasonable questions. We actually kind of answered some of the stuff already. We know, in fact, there's something on there I haven't talked about yet from lecture 1. We know the web is not the internet, right? Yeah. So the internet's physical network itself, the TCP/IP, the protocols, the transmission, the sharing of data. In reality, the internet is a network of smaller networks. So when we talk about the internet, this is the main thing most people do, and especially if they don't come from a computer science background. They go, oh yeah, the internet. Are you really talking about the internet? Or are you talking about WWW, World Wide Web? Or what are you talking about? You know, yeah, I got an internet website. Okay, good. So then you know the person has no idea what they're talking about. So the web, WWW, is the interlinking multimedia documents that are stored in the HTTP protocol, Hypertext Transport Protocol. That's what that stands for. It's not a networking class, so don't worry about knowing the terminology. But key distinction, internet is hardware, web is software. Think of it that way. So when you talk about the internet, we're talking about computers that are connected using protocols like TCP/IP, UDP, RMI, bunch of other technology. That's an internetworking concept. And the internet is both client-server and peer-to-peer. And so in order to understand how websites work, you actually have to know the difference between all of the different networking technologies so that you know what you want to use. So many different internet-based applications exist. These are internet applications, and this would be email, Telnet, FTP, Usenet, instant messaging. Those are internet applications. So document exchange, HTTP, website, that's WWW, that's not internet, that's World Wide Web applications, using a slightly different protocol for the document exchange. I'm not going to go through the history. You could read through the history, or the growth, or the internet growth, or the web, the history of the web, or the growth. I want to go here. Because I know a lot of you guys, I've seen you in my other classes, and I know you're computer science people. If you're not, you're a business student. Lecture number 2, download it. Read through that at a lot slower pace. And you'll hear the history of the internet. You'll hear the history of all these different technologies. But what I really want to talk about is dynamic and static. And I want to talk about client-server and peer-to-peer. Let's start with dynamic and static. HTML is a static language. Yeah, but I could put an animated GIF in there and it can move around the page. It's still static. It's an image. Whether or not the image is animated or not, it's still static. What does static mean? It stands alone. Every time you go to the website, it's always the same. You can't program dynamically with HTML. It doesn't work. So you come back to a website, you go to barnesandnoble.com, you ordered a book, and you come back 10 days later, and it says, hey, welcome back, Barbara. Whoa. How did it know my name? Last time you were here, you ordered Principles of Operating Systems. Now there's a new version of this available. Would you like to download it? Would you like to preview it? That's dynamic. Because the first time I came, I had a different experience than the second time I came. And the first time I came, to this website, it collected a bunch of information from me. And you can actually use scripting languages to take the information and populate it out and do, welcome back, Barbara. You know where that came from, probably a cookie file or something, because it was on my client. So let me talk about clients and servers for a second. Assuming you guys, some of you may not have this background. A server is what you're connecting to. It's kind of like, think of a star. Forget about everything and imagine a server star up in the sky. The star is a server. When we look up at the star, we're connecting to it psychologically. I don't know, we're looking at it. Tons of people on Earth could be looking up at the star, and we're all connecting to the same star. We're all looking at the same star. Kind of like how the computers are connected on the internet. We have a connection that we're doing to a server. That server might be connecting to another server. But most likely we have more clients. You're the client. You're the individual itsy bitsy little computer out here, the mobile phone, the computer, and you're all connecting kind of like you're creating it's kind of like a star configuration if you think about it. You have a center server and you have a bunch of clients all around it connecting to it. And the model is the classic client-server model in terms of what the definition, and that's about as low level as I can make it. Peer-to-peer is when the clients connect to each other. So you have a peer, which is a client, connecting to another client, connecting to another client, connecting to another client. When you do instant messaging, that's really a client-server application. Because otherwise you'd have to go out and connect to all of these different clients. It's not going to work. So the server is a centralized point that everybody connects to. And then on the server, there's an instant messaging application that's saying, okay, A, B, C, all these people connected. Okay, good. Now let's interconnect them. And the server is the one organizing all of the interconnections between all the people who are chatting back and forth. So it's kind of a centralized housing place for all those different technologies. So you have what's called an ISP. It stands for Internet Service Provider or Server Provider. That's your connection to the Internet. So you went and you bought AT&T or SBC, whatever, you have high-speed access at your home or whatever, and you have it here. You connect to the Wi-Fi, you're going to the ITU server, which is a centralized location, and that server is connecting to other servers. And that's how you're getting from point A to point B. You're starting out here in California, connected to a server here in California, but you're communicating with somebody out there in New York because the servers are connected together. So it's really distributed, but it's both models together if you wanted to define it. Because you have, it's distributed, well, and I'm going to bring out a new vocabulary word, distributed computing, distributed network environment, is because all of the work is separated out into different servers. We have email servers, Oracle servers, application servers, web servers, all these different types of servers storing all these different applications and services. It's distributed out all over the world, which makes the internet distributed. It's client-server because we all connect. And that server, if we lose our connection to our server that we've connected to, we have no internet access. Server's down, we're gone. We can't go out and connect to another one. We're all going into the same location. So it makes it client-server. Doesn't make it peer-to-peer from a client perspective, but the servers are peer-to-peer. The servers connect to each other. So that's what makes the internet, I think, the most confusing thing for business people to understand, is because all of the models are represented. So let's bring this back to HTML. What can you do on a client's computer? XHTML, HTML, XML, and client-side, there's a reason why it's called client-side scripting languages. Client-side scripting languages are interpreted by client-side browsers, and the browser's in control. So with XML, HTML, all these different technologies are limited to static normally, unless you mix it in with a scripting language. So let's say you're going to build a BarnesandNoble.com website, and you're going to feed a website, a web page to a client. Client goes www.barnesandnoble.com. So the first thing happens is you're connected to your server, you have connectivity. You ask the server, give me barnesandnoble.com, which is what you're doing in your web browser. Your web browser is using an HTTP protocol to go out to www.barnesandnoble.com and retrieve what's there. So it pulls a document and loads it up into your client. And you're looking at the documents. And you're going to log in because you were a previous customer and you're going to log in to go buy a book. Most likely, that page isn't going to have any intelligence to it. It shouldn't have any intelligence to it. And by intelligence, I mean processing, manipulation. It should get data and send it to the server for processing. Anything that's processed on a client is given to the client. So we have security issues, if you think about it, because do you really want the login name and password of the Barnes & Noble server to be sent to the client so this client can process it on their end, on their side? No, you're going to leave it on the server. You're not going to give it to the client. So we have some applications that run on servers, and we have some that run on clients. And we use HTML for both. So we use XHTML and HTML as the mock-up interface, because what we're really doing with that is programming the browser. We're looking at the browser interface. Whether or not the processing occurs on the client side or whether it occurs on the server side, we don't really care about. The language is the same. But when you start taking a web, okay, so let's go back. This is HTML and CSS. We could take web design. We could also take internetworking, web development. Different course entirely, completely different, because now you're learning scripting languages. You're learning about how to create an application that runs on the server that feeds information to the client, or vice versa. You're learning about security issues, about protocols, about how to communicate a client with a server. That's a networking class. You don't usually learn HTML in that class either. So, different focus. But going back to the concept of static and dynamic, what we're looking at is most web pages that are static. And static means it doesn't move, it sits there. Because we're not using anything on the server, it's all client side. And it's client side, you know what that means right now, hopefully. It's client side because, you know, it's all given to the user. So the content is text, links, images, and it's the same each time the customer actually goes and accesses the page. We can add a little bit of dynamic information to that by using things like cookies. And the reason why we have cookies, which are just small little text files that are stored at the client, gives the server like the ability not to store that information. It's already on your computer. The original concept before it turned into a virus issue was that every time you go to Barnes & Noble, you have to put in your name, your password, you have to log in, you know. The server's not going to remember you the last time you showed up. But if you store the information in what's called a cookie file, it's a little text file that gets stored on the client's machine, your browser can look at the cookie file, bring it up, load the information in, so when you connect to the server, you say, hey, welcome back, Barbara. And then we can create dynamic, on a client, we can actually create dynamic behavior without using the server. It saves it all on the clients. And as we go through the course, towards the end, we'll talk about JavaScript and some of the server scripting languages. Not going to program in them, you're not going to be required to learn them. However, it might give you some insights as to some of the selections, some of the choices you have. It's mostly security related or application speed, efficiency that makes it kind of a decision. So HTML is a static, it's not dynamic. And the web pages, online services, e-commerce web pages that provide more dynamic content generally marry HTML with a scripting language. So if you're familiar with that, then you can kind of figure out, well, you know, how do I get dynamic content? So here's some scripting languages. These are client-side programming languages. JavaScript is client-side. ASP, what is ASP? No, it's server-side. JSP is server-side, if you've heard of those things. JavaScript, I was going to say, is probably the most popular these days in terms of client-side. And what defines a client side? You can download the program from the website. It goes through the HTTP protocol. The program that you're running that gives you the dynamic content is given to the client, which means you can actually lose your internet connection and you would still have the same dynamic behavior going on in the website, which is interesting because it's all happening, all being processed. We're not going to look at applets. You're probably going to never take a class in the year 2011 on applets because applets are going away. Applets are extremely insecure, and they're client-side, and they're huge. And they take forever to download, and they're way too much overhead. So we want fast, speedy applications. Imagine you have a mobile phone, and you have an Android, or an iPhone. You're going to download an applet, you know, a 200 megabyte applet or something to your mobile phone? No. You're going to probably run something off the server. You're going to run a server script. So a lot of people have actually gone, a lot of web developers have gone server-side 100%. So even knowing JavaScript is nice, you can write a nice form checker with it, but you can't really do very much for it because nobody's going to trust anything on the client, and then you know what kind of client you're getting. You don't know how much memory there's going to be, how much processing power. The server you can guarantee. Everybody's connecting to the same server. But the client, you don't know what you're going to get. So it makes it more difficult, especially with changing times. So if you're going to take a internet development, web development course, you're probably going to end up learning a lot of server-side scripting languages. PHP, Python, Perl, Java, JSP, ASP, those types of technologies. So don't ask me about Java applets, we're not making them. Server side, here's our CGI, was the original. Here's your history lesson for today, Common Gateway Interface. Now we have better technologies. CGI never used HTTP as a protocol. If you take a web course, it's way beyond the scope of this course. If you take a web development course, you'll probably understand CGI a little bit better. Active server pages, JSP, PHP, those were some of the scripting languages that I just kind of spitted out a few minutes ago in terms of what they provide. They're providing essentially the same thing. We haven't really advanced that much. We got rid of CGI. We combined server-side scripting with HTTP. But, in fact, I shouldn't say we got rid of CGI. It's still around. In fact, it is quite popular for legacy programs, legacy database connections and stuff. But modern day stuff, if you're going to build an application from scratch, you're going to use a server-side scripting language. Alright, so see, I told you, as promised, that was extremely quick. So that was lecture 2, and I think I'm gonna end at that unless there's any questions. Anybody has any questions? That is about as much introduction as I can give you, I think. Next week we're gonna start writing HTML code. So if you bring in a notepad computer with a notepad browser, you can do it on a Mac. It's the same thing as a Windows machine. So we'll run through a bunch of tags, and I'll write the tags out for you, and I'll make mistakes. We'll see what happens when I run them, and then we'll see what happens with different browsers and stuff like that too. So, okay, see you next week. Ciao.